Margaret Fuller's Femality exhibit that I curated for the Marjorie Barrick Art Museum, inspired by the writing of Margaret Fuller, both her feminist text and her art criticism. This exhibit pairs quotes from Fuller and other feminist writers like Donna Haraway and Virginia Woolf and Mary Wollstonecraft with works of visual art. Of course, we start off the exhibit with a short basic biography about Margaret Fuller that kind of gives a little bit of her background for those who might not be familiar with her. She was a unique woman during her time because she received a very rigorous education, even more rigorous than some of the men during her time. So this, of course, made her fitted for intellectual projects that were typically given to men, but then she's forced by social custom to kind of inhabit the sphere of women. She kind of ends up straddling both worlds a little bit and breaking boundaries in both. She was an incredible woman. She was a war correspondent over in Italy. She started out, she was writing articles for the New York Tribune and Horace Greeley, and then when she got assigned overseas and the Italian Revolution broke out, she ended up writing about the events that were happening around her. So she kind of inadvertently became a war correspondent. She was a strong advocate for the rights of women, for abolitionism, social reform. Her Woman in the 19th Century text is one of the first feminist texts in the United States to ever be published. And she's held these really interesting conversation series in the parlors of her female friends, encouraging women to develop the intellectual and elocutionary skills so that they could discuss their own thinking, their own ideas about art and politics from an intellectual perspective rather than an emotional position. So she kind of ends up straddling both worlds to an extent, which really ends up inspiring her thinking in her writing and her concept of femality. So this exhibit, of course, is focused on her concept of femality. And so the very first pairing of visual works that we have are centered around her quote defining femality, which she defines as male and female representing the two sides of the great radical dualism. But in fact, they are passing perpetually into one another. Fluid rushing into solid, solid into fluid, no wholly masculine man, no purely feminine woman. So there's this idea that the two types, two attributes of qualities of gender are constantly and perpetually mixing back and forth. So to kind of represent this concept, I chose a diptych by Eric Lopresti, which seemed to kind of visually represent the energy that is in her concept of femality, with the concave of this crater serving as the sort of convex, the inverse of the concave to the convex of the pink lily. This idea of sort of a cyclical passing back and forth, sinking down and blooming up of that kind of female masculine energy in the radical dualism. Also, this image by James Goebel seems similarly in flux, sort of a dialectical image that can kind of sort of sway towards more masculine or more feminine depending on the viewer, and kind of goes back and forth between the two. This part of the exhibit is the Tree Self-Portrait Gallery, where people have been creating portraits of what they would look like as a tree. It's inspired by Margaret Fuller's short story, The Magnolia of the Lake Pontchartrain, in which the story, a magnolia tells her life story to a traveler, and the magnolia explains that she wasn't always a magnolia. Originally, she started out as an orange tree, And the orange tree represents sort of the Victorian domestic role of women at that time, making the transformation of her from orange into magnolia transformation, it's sort of a rejection of the traditional domestic roles, feminine roles, and transformation into an artist, producing the beautiful fragrance song that entices the traveler to come find and talk with her. So here are some of the tree self-portraits. This was a tamarind tree that was made by Zuli Mejia, inspired by her family history. This one is another one of the tree self-portraits by Holly Lay. This is by local artist J.K. Russ. A really beautiful tree self-portrait she put together for this exhibit. And we've got Jiao Ming Tang doing a collage tree self-portrait. We'll get up close to kind of get a better look at what's happening in this complex construction. This is actually my own tree self-portrait that I made quite a number of years ago, where I was feeling like I was fusing with a willow tree. And we just have several more tree self-portraits here. Oh, we don't want to miss this little guy right here. Little tiny guy getting lost in the green. And then we have a number of self-portraits here that were created during a workshop that took place during the exhibit, where we supplied paper and drawing materials for visitors to create their own tree self-portraits while they were sitting in the middle of the exhibit. And this one actually just came today. It's a tree self-portrait as an apple tree made of recycled materials. I'm very honored to have inspired such a creative production. It's really an amazingly complex structure that they have put together here. All the little things. There's even some birds in there. Okay, and so that's the tree self-portrait gallery. Moving on, this is a painting by local artist Lolita Devalet that she created called Secrets to Tell. I've paired this painting with a quote by Donna Haraway that talks about the cyborgs as beings of quintessence. And of course, quintessence is sort of a fifth element, an unquantified substance, an idea of an element that is sort of unknown. So it's this unknown and therefore undefined and therefore flawless, because it can't be flawed if you don't have definition. And so I paired it with this painting because these beings, they look a lot like cyborgs, and they also feel very genderless. The clothing on them it just hangs on them sort of arbitrarily, doesn't necessarily, denote their gender. They could be anything with the clothes that have been put on them. And they do seem to really kind of capture that idea of quintessence. They seem to kind of absorb the light of the space, like they are just soaking it in, or maybe they're just made of light. So they just really felt like a good representation of Haraway's quintessence idea. This is the one painting on the show that is not from the Barrick's collection. I actually approached Lolita out in the community to allow me to display her painting as part of this show. I feel like Haraway's ideas about quintessence really pair quite well with Virginia Woolf's comments on the androgynous mind and the incandescent qualities of that mind. That's the Virginia Woolf quote that I've placed in conjunction with a Modigliani piece, in which the long, still lines offer kind of an androgynous face, but also a very calming stillness. Sort of the idea that this face is not only androgynous, but also still running deep meditative thoughts. Also paired with the androgynous mind quote that is resonant and porous, is this sculpture by Harold Paris that gives us sort of this golden tablet that really kind of, for me, has that color of incandescence, that kind of golden glow that really just, for me, it sparked that quote in my memory when I looked at it and chose it for this exhibit. And it also has a lot to do with thought and the thinking process. You can see that up at the top, there's this bubble welling up. And so for me, it's the idea that, the merging of the masculine and the feminine together is producing this thought, this bubble that is welling up to the surface, a creative idea that is kind of literally occurring within the mind at that moment. And so it's that idea of the creative, porous mind producing thoughts, merging the male and the female, like Woolf talks about in A Room of One's Own. It also, for me, really invokes Fuller's concept of the radical dualism with the fluid rushing into solid. We literally have the solid that the fluid that has rushed into and become a solid in this image. And it really reminds me a lot of Freud's mystic pad of memory, and the idea of like how the memory process works, where you have thoughts literally hitting the surface of the mind, bubbling on the surface, and then of course later on sinking down into the deeper wax of long-term memory. Moving right along, we have a piece by Lance Smith, From Memory, and I've paired that with a quote from the story, the Magnolia story, which talks about feminine creative power. And so this idea of thinking about the mother, bringing up the sort of feminine presence from the memory, and the idea that there is some feminine presence within everyone all the time. And then last but not least, we have right here a painting by Mary Warner called Disco Garden. And I had actually seen this painting so many times before, but the last time that I looked at it, this quote by Wollstonecraft just flitted through my mind, and suddenly this painting had a new meaning for me, and the shadowed stems suddenly were the stems and the leaves that Wollstonecraft talks about here that are fading. The idea of this overemphasis of cosmetic beauty over strength and intellect, and the way this painting emphasizes these glorious pendulous blooms and de-emphasizes the stems that are required to support those heavy blossom tops. And also included in the show, I just felt like a show about literature had to have books, and so we included the first page of the story of the Magnolia of Lake Pontchartrain, and we also have here pages about femality from Margaret Fuller's Woman in the 19th Century that are on display. So that is the exhibit, Beauteous Tree, that I've put together. It was a wonderful experience, and I really enjoyed putting these visuals with this quoted material, and how the quotes, on that green background became kind of elevated to the level of sort of paintings themselves, so striking and independent. So for me, this was just a really wonderful joining of text and image to explore this concept of femality. And thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed this little informal tour, and it gives you an idea of what this project was all about. Thanks for watching.